This week's show brought to you by Clorox. Apparently, they're an Oakland company. Who knew? Welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, aka Nerd Numbers, and with me, as always, is my producer, voice of God, co-host, man of many hats, Brian Foster, who you can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Say hey, Brian.
What's going on, Dre? Spring is here. We're deep into the NBA playoffs now. It's a little bit less rainy. I might plant my garden soon. And of course, the NFL owners are still being corrupt. So that's a year round thing. So a lot of stuff to talk about today. It's going to be a good show.
Well, of course, the focus we're going to look at is NBA playoffs because that's what's going on. I'm going to take a slight detraction first, though, to talk about a team that's not in the playoffs but has been very much in our mind, the Los Angeles Lakers. We're going to talk the Lakers first. That's going to lead us into the playoffs. We might talk a little bit about what you teased at the start, the NFL, stadiums, corrupt owners. That should be our show, should be plenty because, yeah, the playoffs, full swing, lot to talk about. All right, well, I made a tweet today about Magic Johnson where he, I guess, when he met with Jeannie Buss, said he does not see a star on the current Lakers, which is completely reasonable. In fact, I knocked over my water bottle, but he, if you look at the current Lakers, they don't have any stars. They've got some high draft picks that, haven't really panned out. D'Angelo Russell, who's the other number two that I'm forgetting this year?
Oh, yeah. Julius Randle was also a high pick. He was from a couple years ago. Yeah.
No, I thought they had a different one to start this year. Am I crazy?
Oh, they might, yeah, but they not anyone who's played well. I'll say the most exciting young player they have is Larry Nance Jr., who I think they don't even consider a starter. So
he was not a starter. He wasn't picked in the draft. He's not who they're talking about. My Surface Pro. This is not an endorsement. In fact, quite the contrary. Runs ridiculously low. So I'm going to try and look up who the Lakers picked in the draft because I know it wasn't D'Angelo Russell. But basically, I really liked this point from Magic Johnson where he said they don't have a star. I guess I've been reading too that Jeannie Buss says the onus is actually on the Lakers to win now. So I'm really a fan that they're not going for the tank mode. In fact, that was one thing that kind of shocked us at the end of the season is there were games where a normal team we would have thought they would have shut it down, wouldn't have won some games, maybe hurt their draft picks a few percent. We've talked this before. I don't want to go too much in depth, but obviously that, anybody that understands gambling, anybody that understands expected value should understand that, well, yes, you can improve your odds of, getting a high draft pick by losing a couple extra games. It is marginal. And the utility, if you actually view what happens, we've Dave Barry in The Wages of Wins, the book, talks about this, the cost of losing games on your fan base, on your ticket sales, etc., essentially boils down to it's probably not worth the money. It's probably not worth the trade-off. And that's what people miss. I always view tanking for a draft pick very much like, buy 5 canisters of sushi at the gas station, get the 6th one free. Technically, it's a deal. But if you're able to do any kind of cost-benefit analysis, you're realizing that it's probably not worth, the cost that you're putting into it, your health, et cetera. It is Brandon Ingram, by the way, fail on both of our parts, Brian. And he was terrible. He was terrible his first season.
Yeah, he had such a good year. I can't believe I forgot about him.
Yeah, so the only point I wanted to make there is, the Lakers in this upcoming draft should really hope that they get the number 2 pick. We kind of brought this up last podcast where they've lost the draft 2 years in a row getting the number 2 pick, and they missed out on Ben Simmons and obviously Karl Anthony Towns the season before.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? So they missed out on the obvious good number 1 pick. The one thing I'll say, Ben Simmons always helps because this is just old hat. We've talked this a lot before about drafts, but even if the numbers say the person is great, even if we agree, even if they look great, there's nothing to guarantee their health. So just because you win the draft doesn't even necessarily mean you win. But if there's a year for them to win the number 2 pick in the draft, it's definitely this year because between Markelle Fultz and Lonzo Ball, at least according to the numbers we've looked at, looks superior in every sense of the word. However, that's not necessarily what I would think the Lakers need to target if they want to win now. The Lakers do need to target a star. I would argue an established veteran. Here's the point that's going to lead me into the playoffs. Magic Johnson, basically, there have been rumors, obviously the rumor mill doesn't mean anything. And the NBA is so stupid where people can't be overt in things because it breaks, the CBA or whatever. So if an owner wants a star player, they can't come out and say, I would like the star player, even saying things. I believe there have been cases where, owners were saying so-and-so is a great player. have been fined because it's argued that they're trying to make overtures at that player. So I've just read the rumor mill a little. Magic Johnson apparently is interested in Paul George. And so this is going to lead us into the first playoff series. We're going to talk Cleveland, Indiana for two reasons. The first is, I'm very baffled, Brian, on Paul George's pedigree in the mainstream. And the reason is, this is really odd to me. This is just bizarro year for me. This is backward year. This is the year I'm defending DeMarcus Cousins. This is the year I'm defending Russell Westbrook from Dean Oliver. I don't understand what's going on. This is the year I'm going to say Paul George is overrated. And a couple of years back when the Indiana Pacers had improved, I said Paul George was a star player that I didn't really think was getting the love he deserved and respect he deserved for the improvement on the Pacers. And now I'm going to say he's overrated. Now, to be clear, we think Paul George, this is rough, as a power forward is a below average player. Now, if you're going to be someone who makes the argument that he's really a stretch four and it's unfair of us to grade him as a power forward because he's really a small forward and he's doing all the things a small forward should do and he's been played out of position, fine. The reason we grade this way, by the way, is, and this is old hat, we've said this every podcast, Brian, if you're a regular listener of the show, you've heard this. I'm just assuming there are some new people that haven't. The way it works is if you are played in various positions in basketball, point guard, wing, big, the position you are given impacts what we're going to expect of your stats. Very much so the comparison in, baseball is if you're hitting in the middle of the order, we're expecting you to get more RBIs. We're expecting you to get more runs. It does not make sense if you are looking at a player that gets to play closer to the hoop to not acknowledge that they are probably going to be getting shots closer to the hoop, that they're not going to be getting more rebounds. So when we look at Paul George, the reason we are considering him a big is he's played as a big. All the sites are going to agree with this. Now, that said, even if we thought that Paul George was a small forward, a pure wing player, he would be a good, not great player according to our numbers. Now, to be fair, if you look at Paul George, as a rookie, he was a great player for a rookie and a good player for an NBA player. As we've always noted with rookie players, rookies tend to be below average. So when I say a great rookie, I mean a good NBA player. Sophomore year, he's a Brian star, not quite a Dre star. By that, what we mean is if you look at the wins per 48, Brian tends to like 200 players. This amounts to kind of a 3 margin in everything else being equal, meaning if the player played the full game on an average team against average opponents, we would expect that team to win by 3 points a game, which is quite good. A Dre star is 10 wins in a full 82 NBA season. So anyway, he kind of hits that level. If you look at Paul George's history, that's what I've got up in front of me, Brian. In 2012, 2013, 2014, Paul George hovers around 11 wins and around 200 wins per 48 as a small forward. That's what he's listed as. That's what we consider him. That's great. Now, if you recall, in 2014, Paul George is on the international team and in a practice game suffers a freak injury, runs into the back. I don't recall the exact specifics, but it was something like he ran into the hoop or whatever, the stop in the hoop, and really hurt his leg. And he's out almost the entire 2015 season. And when he comes back, two things happened. First, he has essentially played more at the power forward position. Whatever happened on Indiana, the trades, the players, et cetera, obviously I think they'd had, how am I dropping his name? The big guy. I'm really mad that
on the Pacers, Roy Hibbert?
Right. Wow. Yeah, you did great. The last couple of shows, Brian, I've listened back. You've missed some of the questions I've had for help. You nailed that. Roy Hibbert. So obviously they had Roy Hibbert. Hibbert sucks, gets traded away, whatever. So Paul George starts playing bigger, and even if we take that into consideration, he's not playing at the same levels he was playing in 2012 and 2014. So he's playing worse, and he's getting played bigger out of position. So even if we thought last season Paul George was a pure wing player, we would say he's a good player, not a great player, and even more so because he's playing as a big, we say he's a below average player. And what you could make the argument, and we don't necessarily agree, that if Paul George was played as a wing on another team, such as the Lakers, that his numbers would stay consistent. He's just getting played out of position. Fine. We don't agree because typically what we say is if you're going to be played as a big, you're getting closer to the hoop, you're going to luck into rebounds, etc. But I think Paul George is a average to above average player as a wing based on the numbers I've seen the last couple of seasons. And a lot of that is injury. I mean, this is the rough part. This is a player that I talk all the time is Isaiah Thomas. Isaiah Thomas, if you look at his age curve.
This is Pistons Isaiah Thomas, right? Not the current one.
Yeah,
Isaiah Thomas.
Isaiah Thomas Not the current Isaiah Thomas. We'll talk him in a second. But if we talk Pistons Isaiah Thomas, that at age, I think, 25, he looked spectacular. And then he just falls off a cliff. And I think I've heard some rumblings that he basically got an injury. And he was just never the same after that injury. And the same thing is true here. Paul George got an injury and he came back, and all the power to him. Don't forget the same thing happened with Grant Hill back in the day. He was an amazing, amazing player. He gets injured. It takes him a while to recuperate. He comes back. He's a good player on the Suns, but he's nowhere close to what he was. And so that's kind of my thinking on Paul George is he's a good player, but he's not at the same levels he was when he was younger. And obviously, broken record time, the whole reason people love him now is yay points. He's scoring, I think, the most points. He's playing the most minutes with the most points scored that he has in his career. And people are missing that the other stuff isn't as strong. His assist to turnover ratio isn't particularly good. His rebounds for a big are below average. And while he's a good scorer, it's very much the same vein as Klay Thompson. If you are going to basically be a role player, and that sounds rough to call Paul George this, but if the one skill you have that makes everybody love you is scoring, you have to be spectacular at it, and he is good, not amazing. So that kind of interested me. And obviously, I want to bring that up in the Indiana versus Cleveland series, because this series was over quick. It was a sweep, but it was odd to me watching it because it was much closer than it should have been, and it took way more out of LeBron than I would have expected for this kind of series. I'm curious if you had any thoughts on Paul George to finish up before I talk the Cleveland-Indiana series, Brian.
Yeah, I'm ready for that, but just real fast on Paul George. We've got his player page up here on Boxscore Geeks, and it's mostly agreeing with what you're saying, especially on the points per game here. Look at his field goal attempts, way higher after the injury, after he became a power forward, much lower, back when he was a small forward and before he got hurt. I don't know if that's a coincidence or not. I'm guessing the Pacers coaches didn't say, this guy's hurt, that means we got to turn him into a big man. I think it's just a coincidence based on roster moves. But, yeah, so the shooting, so that's one thing. So, but then if you look at his raw production, 80 JP 48, that's what he produces before we do the position adjustment. So that's, irregardless of what he's playing here. It's not much worse than when he was earlier in his career. He has these two good years.
What I'll point out is if you look at these last 2 years, the 0.256 and 0.252 per 48. As Brian mentioned, the way, if you don't know how the wins produce formula, points over power formula works, it works as follows. There's been a regression analysis done on how box score statistics equate to wins. So we're able to look at a player's box score, look at all of their stats, and say, here is how much they are contributing to the raw wins on a team. The next thing we do, the same thing baseball does, is we compare to position, and we simplified it last year. There's been yes, no against it, but what we do is we say we compare point guards to point guards, wing players, this is shooting guards and small forward to shooting guards and small forwards, and power forwards and centers to power forwards and centers. Those are three bins, because we basically, as I was saying earlier, point guard gets the ball a lot, so we expect more assists. Wings get more perimeter shots, so we expect more shots out of them and fewer rebounds. Bigs get more rebounds shot closer to the hoop, so we expect that. So we adjust for that. So when we are looking at a player, the one thing you could easily do is you could just look at their production, everybody's production, and say wins, and not factor anything equal. The reason we compare to averages, we accept that basketball has multiple positions. It's not the same. The simplest comparison, right, in like baseball is you have pitchers, and pitchers don't have the same hitting numbers as hitters. So when you're trying to compare players, you compare pitchers to pitchers, hitters to hitters, is what it is. So what Brian's noting is that Paul George's per minute production in the recent seasons isn't as bad as is not that far like it was in 2013. The other thing that we do is we compare to league average for that season. This is really important. As we've mentioned in past shows, the NBA is a zero-sum game. Even if
so let me ask you a question about that. Is if it's compared to league average, is that done before or after the 80 JP 48? Is it included in that number or not?
That's after. So that's the point. Is the wins per 48 factors in position and league average. The 80J 48 is raw. But so the reason the average gets important, and we've been talking this, is, for instance, as we know, Paul George's scoring is the best it's been in his entire career. His effective field goal percentage, 53.3%, true shooting percentage, 58.6%, the best it's been in his career. Now, by the way, another thing you should be worried about if you're targeting Paul George, it is certainly possible that Paul George has taken a jump and will be at this level for the rest of his career. I think players like James Harden, Steph Curry, Russell Westbrook, who had this kind of jump and stayed at that level. It could also be that he's just exceeding kind of his baseline. And he's going to regress to the mean next season. But anyway, the last point I wanted to make on the league average, Brian, when you're saying it's not that far from previous seasons, we have noted that the NBA this year, if you look at effective field goal percentage, which is largely driven by how many threes teams are taking. If you look at how well teams are shooting from free throw, scoring is the best it has ever been in the NBA, and that is awesome for fans. But what it also means you need to realize is that if you have a scorer and they are good and they're playing the best they ever have, for instance, Russell Westbrook's true shooting is close to the highest it's been in his career. But when you compare to league average, a lot of players have actually gotten worse with inflation. I think we made this note about like CJ McCollum. His scoring's got a little better, but so did the rest of the league.
So does this mean then that, okay, so here's what I'm looking at right now. 2 seasons that Paul George has had. And again, we're looking at his player page here on Boxscore.com. So this season, his unadjusted production, ADJP 48, was .252 basically, but his wins per 48 was only .036. Now, compared to his 2012-2013 season, very similar ADJP, but his wins per 48 is way, way higher. Now, first of all, yeah, obviously the position difference is huge. He's competing against different types of players here. Now, but you're saying is the raw production is relatively worse this year than it was a few years ago, even though it's the same, because the league has gotten better in that amount of time.
Yeah, in fact, what you can do, Brian, you're like helping with an infomercial. If you go to the tools tab and type in Paul George, that'll be for this season, and compare. You can take a look. And then also type in 2013. Now, what I would do for this season is I would also tack on, say, an easy one, Klay Thompson. So do Paul George and Klay Thompson. So compare them for this season. And then for 2013, just compare Paul George. The average... I don't know how
to do more than 1 year at once. But anyway, we've got these years up right now.
But once, I'm saying you want to do
okay.
like a tab. Don't you multi-tab it, Brian? Isn't that you're a Silicon Valley guy? I thought that's how you do. You have like 20 billion tabs open on your browser. No?
Yeah, I do, but you have to manage those tabs, just like you're managing your memory when you were using C++ back in the day.
Wow, old reference. Anyway, so this season, an average wings adjusted per 48 number, and that's what we're going to compare to, is 0.204. So 204. And as we mentioned, Paul George's number is 252. And so what you would do is this gets confusing. I'm really sorry. This has got to be boring. And there's no way audio this goes well. But basically you subtract.
Got to watch the video show.
And add back 99. So if we did that, Paul George would have a wins per 40 about 150, which we consider good, not great.
Now, that's someone you'd want to give a max to, right? But still someone you'd want in your starting lineup.
But here's what's key. If you look at 2012, 2013, when Paul George's numbers were similar, an average wing had an adjusted production per 48 minutes of 178, 0.178. I'm going to do like the baseball thing. When it takes 200, Brian, I'm going to just start doing that. So an average wing would have 178. So basically, we'll notice that the average wing has jumped up like over 2 points since 2013. And a lot of that has to do with scoring. So even if you go, like, this is what's always really rough about the NBA. You look at a player, you say, holy cow, their numbers compared to 5 seasons ago are way better. They've improved it. You have to go, did the league improve as well? Because if the league improved, it's like I've mentioned this a bunch about sports. It's zero sum. In the business world, if you improve your revenues year to year, it does, your business can be doing great. But in sports, if you improve your scoring efficiency by 100 wins a game, 100 runs, not wins, 100 runs a season, which sounds fantastic, right? That'd be almost a run a game in baseball. But everybody else in the league improves their runs by 200 runs in a season. You've lost ground. And so that's all I'm saying is you can look at Paul George and say, well, his raw numbers are about as good as they were in 2013. And you said he was almost a star level player then. Why are you different now? And the reason is he's being played as a power forward this season, and the league has gotten better.
I agree with all that, and here's I guess my final point I was trying to make here is everything he says is true, but I would say that that reduction is not as significant as him being played out of position. I think that's more important than his injury.
The reason I think it's important is that even if I would be shocked to think that he would play better as a small forward than how he's been played as a power.
You could be right.
Because his scoring has gone up. and his rebounds and such are going up. He's just not good at that. So what I'm saying is, if I was a team looking at Paul George and I said he's being played out of position, that's fine. And by the way, there are lots of teams that should make this analysis. It's one of our arguments for why Mike D'Antoni did so well with the Rockets is that he basically looked at that team and said, why the heck is James Harden the shooting guard? He should be the point guard. And for what it's worth, one of Michael Jordan's best years, he was played as a point guard, and he just didn't like it. And we've had this same problem too. Kevin Garnett never liked being played as a center. Carmelo Anthony didn't really like being played as a power forward. You have players that are prima donnas, divas, that don't like being played in a position, but there are coaches that can wisely analyze and go, this player is being played out of position, because what can happen if a player is played out of position is you basically have some we love the term opportunity cost on the show. If you're playing a player out of position, you are giving up some production there. And Ari Caroline's floor stretch research back in the they said, yeah, if you play small ball, you can get away with playing small ball, but you're going to have to make up those rebounds somewhere. And for what it's worth, by the way, we've noted this before, Steph Curry, at least last season, was amazing at rebounding. So that's one way you can kind of do it. So, but so with Paul George being played out of position, the Lakers might recognize, okay, Paul George, you're being played out of position. We're going to play you a small forward. Fine. But what we basically said is if you compare Paul George to kind of league average, we think he's a good, not great player. And you don't want a max. Like, I'm never really a fan of a max long-term deal player that's not really a legitimate star. In fact, it's one reason I was okay with DeMarcus Cousins going to the New Orleans Pelicans this season when I wrote up about it. It's that I don't want DeMarcus Cousins on a long-term deal on my team, but he's only on a 2-year deal. So the Pelicans can sign him this year, next year, evaluate how well he's doing. They have his bird right. So if they think he's made the jump, they can offer him more for another deal. But if he's not, they can let him leave or trade him. And so the same thing is true here. If the Lakers are targeting Paul George, there are tiers of star players to go after. And I would put Paul George in like the second or third tier. He's not a top tier player. When people say players like Jimmy Butler and Paul George, I'm like, what the hell?
Oh, yeah, I agree.
Jimmy Butler is miles ahead of Paul George. It's not even close.
Yeah, so let's say if you're the Lakers, you're like, we're actually a smart team now. We think he's being played out of position. Should we pay him a lot of money and turn him into a small forward? The answer is no. Even as a small forward, he's still not worth a lot of money. And on top of that, it's a worse position than being a big man, right? If Paul George actually could be a big and play well there, that might be worth spending money on. Or if he could play point guard, that might be worth spending money on. But wing players, they got to be really good before you want to spend the money on them. And just one last thing on the position adjustment, because whenever we talk about Paul George, a lot of people come into the comments. I'll make this quick.
Here for playoff talks are like, oh my God, thank you. This is amazing. Okay,
I'll make this quick. No, this is a good talk. So people just say, well, if you don't like the position adjustment, just look at the raw stats or whatever. You can just do that instead. But the position adjustment really matters. And Ari Caroline's article looks at this quite a bit. Here's the reason. So if you've got Paul George playing power forward now, that means he needs to be playing near the hoop and getting the rebounds, right? That's why he's compared against other big men, because he has the opportunity to use that space near the basket, and that's limited, right? You can't have all 5 players underneath the basket at once.
Yeah.
So people will say he actually might get used as a stretch 4 so he doesn't go underneath the basket. Well, that's a coaching decision. If you're just going to vacate the middle and let the other team rebound all day, that's a coaching decision. But really, yeah, if you're being played as a bigger player, that gives you the opportunity to go down low.
Yeah, anytime. There's tons in the NBA about this, right? There's diminishing returns if you sign multiple stars. When the Miami Heat signed LeBron James, Chris Bosh, and Dwayne Wade, they basically had to acknowledge we're signing 3 great scorers. Somebody's going to get hit, and that happened. Chris Bosh was basically kind of redundant with LeBron James, which is what it is. So I think anytime you're a team, you are analyzing trade-offs and opportunity costs. What I would say, I kind of at Paul George. What I would note is I'm not against the Lakers signing Paul George. It's actually the same point I made about Al Horford on Boston. We'll go to them next. It's that if you are going to sign this player, it should be the thing that gets you over the hump. So if you are a 50-win team that needs one more piece, actually a player I'll throw into this mix, it's gonna pain me, Brian. It's gonna pain me to give him credit, but I actually think he did matter. Rasheed Wallace. I think the Detroit Pistons were like, we are a tiny piece away from a title, and they got Rasheed Wallace, who was kind of an upgrade at the 4, whatever. And his defense was great. Like his numbers seemed to indicate he was a great defensive player, just not great at offense. They grab Rasheed Wallace. That gets him over the hump. Now, I say he's not a good player, but maybe, and that could be wrong. I think the numbers indicate he wasn't actually that good, and I think I'm kind of
I
lying on
loved
this.
Rasheed Wallace back in the day, but yeah, looking at his numbers after the fact, they weren't as good as he looked on the court.
But anyway, all I'm saying is, if Paul George is the player that gets you from 50 wins to 60 wins, great. But if you're a team like the Lakers, who are a 25-win team that is looking to be a 45-win team with the star, he's not the player to target. He reminds me a lot of Luol Deng only a couple years earlier. So that's all I'm saying is if the Lakers are looking for a star, players, obviously it's too late in this boat, but players like Kevin Durant, maybe Kevin Love, LeBron James already signed a 3-year deal, so no. But I'm saying those tier of player, yes, Paul George, if you get one of those players, go next. So we'll see what happens, but who knows? The other advantage that the Lakers have relative to the rest of the league is they have so much damn money that they get Paul George, and then Paul George can maybe attract another star. There are other teams, stupid teams like OKC, who are like, we can't afford to pay for that extra star. The Lakers are going to be willing to go like triple the salary cap if it makes them a contender. But okay, so sorry, that was a really long tangent about the Cleveland-Indiana series. All I was going to point out is I was shocked by how many people were impressed by LeBron James, not because LeBron James wasn't impressive, but because this series was way closer than people realized. The Cleveland Cavaliers only won by 15 points net. That's all 4 games. There were some very close games that the Pacers were really close to winning. In fact, I'm seeing some salt in the wound. They're arguing a 3-pointer from LeBron James in Game 4 should not have counted. So Pacers fans can be mad that maybe it should have been a 5-game series, a 6-game series. And I think part of the reason that people are overestimating how great the Cavaliers look this series is they're overestimating Paul George. And Paul George did play very well in this series. But what I'm saying is, if you're a Cavaliers fan, you should be a little freaked out. And I'll get on to our next series using this as a hook, Brian, because this shouldn't have been a hard series. This is a 42-win team. Cleveland is a defending champ, and they basically were kind of struggling against a weak team. And in fact, we've noticed that Toronto's in a 2-2 tie against the number 8 seed. And in fact, we got to admit, they got lucky that Rajon Rondo's out for the season. Atlanta and the Wizards are in a 2-2 tie. Like, the East is freaking terrible, and the top of the East is having trouble with these kind of weaker teams. I don't really have a ton to say about this, Brian, but I didn't want to talk about this series a bunch, so I'll just use this as an opportunity to get my licks in here. I am shocked about freaking the Spurs in Memphis, though, to be fair.
Oh, yeah.
They were up 2-0 last week when we talked about them. We're like, yeah, they're doing what they're supposed to. We said Memphis was a weak team. San Antonio looks great. Kawhi's a great player. And they're tied 2-2.
Mike Conley got in there.
Is what it is. I have no real idea what to say. That series has shocked me. I have not looked at it in depth, but I still expect San Antonio to do well. But one kind of note we've made in passing is all of our stats say that Greg Popovich is an amazing regular season coach. All of our numbers have said that Greg Popovich is one of the best coaches in terms of player development. And, pretty much our numbers also say he kind of plays the right rotation. We've also argued rest. We were arguing that a while back where in kind of a money-ballish movement, the one thing it took a while to catch on, people didn't copy the Spurs, which is odd because they're clearly the smartest analytics team. And rest was a big thing that they've been on for years now. They started resting Tim Duncan, I think, over a decade ago. So they've clearly known about rest. But it is worth noting that the Spurs have underperformed in the playoffs relative to their the strength of their team a lot in previous years. So for what it's worth, the Spurs they do tend to be very Billy Beanish, and it's my shit don't work in the playoffs. So who knows? I expect them to beat Memphis, but they have lost to Memphis in a round 1 matchup before in the past. So we'll see what happens.
And it has been, home teams holding court so far, holding serve, whatever the tennis analogy is. So yeah, Spurs look great when they're playing at home. They didn't look as great on the road. Maybe they'll just finish it up. Now they have a few more home games. Yeah, who knows? But I'm not worried. I think they'll be fine.
So actually, I wrote an article that I released last Friday, and it was based on last week's podcast because we were talking about Boston and how, they were in a 0-2 hole to Chicago. I think that happened as we were recording last week's show, and we were kind of saying, well, it's it's not surprising because they are one of the weakest teams. And what I found, lo and behold, is if you go back to the 3-point era of basketball, the Boston Celtics have the weakest SRS. This is the simple rating scale over at Basketball Reference. What it is it's a team's point margin, how much they outscore their opponent, adjusted for strength of schedule. So they basically are below 3 on their point margin. As we noted, when we consider star players, about 3 in points over par, which is a very similar concept, how much you'd outscore the opponent by. 3 is star level. So they are one of only 2 teams in NBA history, modern NBA history at least. I'm pretty sure the 60s were the same, but whatever. To have an SRS below 3. The only other one that had an SRS below 3 was the Detroit Pistons in 2003, and they did not make the finals. And in fact, looking at that year in 2003, the Pistons were actually weaker by that metric, the SRS number, than some other teams, including the New Jersey Nets, who did actually make it to the finals. And the other thing that makes it far, far worse is that the Pistons are the weakest team to win their conference in NBA history, or at least modern NBA history, without a star player. Because the one team, the one kind of ray of hope you might have if you were looking at this is in 2010, the Los Angeles Lakers won it all, won everything. But a few things happened. First off, they had the third weakest SRS in their conference, behind the Utah Jazz and the San Antonio Spurs. But they were much closer. They were much closer in regards to their SRS to those two teams than any other team, including Boston is. Boston is, for instance, a far weaker team than Cleveland by the numbers. But also, the Utah Jazz got unlucky. Andrea Kirilenko got injured, and he was one of their best players.
He was
good. One of the teams that was better than them lost one of their better players, and then they swept them. And then the San Antonio Spurs, we were just talking about underperforming in the playoffs, were another team that had a better SRS, and they got upset by the Phoenix Suns. So the basic point I'll give you is if you're a weak team in the playoffs, it is certainly possible for you to win the whole show. For instance, Cleveland last year was a much weaker team than Golden State, but of course, the thing they lucked into is the only team that was stronger than them that they had to face in the playoffs was Golden State, and they got through the Eastern Conference relatively unscathed, right? I think they won, they only had to go 16 games, if I recall. It was like...
I can't remember.
It was like 4, 12, 6. So they only went 2 games more than they need the minimum to get in. Whereas Golden State, had a game 7 against OKC because of injuries to Steph Curry. Went a little longer in earlier series. Obviously Steph Curry is injured in the finals. Andrew Bogut gets injured in the finals. Draymond Green gets suspended. So, if you're going to be a weaker strength of schedule adjusted point margin team in the playoffs, what you're really, really hoping for is one lucky break against a better team, and then some other lucky breaks to knock the tougher teams out of your way. And the rough part about Boston is that is just not true. There are at least 2 rounds that will guaranteed have a much stronger strength of schedule team than they already have. And we thought it looked dire last week, right? We thought they were out of it, and they just kind of lucked out to the fact that Rajon Rondo got injured. And to be fair, F Chicago fans who've just been crapping on Rajon Rondo, because to be fair, he has not been as good as he has in previous seasons. I would argue he's a bad fit on that team. They just get some outside scorers. Like, actually, Paul George would be a good fit on the freaking Bulls, right? They already have. I was saying, Paul George is that next piece you would want if you already have it. If they have Paul George instead of Dwayne Wade, I think that takes him to the next level.
I mean, Rondo was fine, wasn't he, Dre? He didn't have a great season, but he wasn't high salary either, I don't think.
Well, he was an above average player. Given his strengths, he did fine, and I'm arguing he would have been better. He's a passer. He would be a much better passer if he had people that could make outside shots. And I've always kind of hated the floor stretch argument to just justify volume shooters like Kobe, who for his career had basically a below average effective field goal percentage, meaning how well he shot from the field. The way he made it up was free throws. I've never been a fan of people who go, well, they're volume shooters, they're stretching the floor. But I am a huge fan of saying a player is an efficient shooter from the floor, and thus they stretch the floor because the opponent has to respect them. So I think Rajon Rondo with a few floor stretchers is a potent player because Rajon Rondo can then pass the ball to those players and they'll make high efficiency shots. So I think the Bulls, Rondo's a bad fit on that team, but in spite of that, he played above average, easily worth the money. He's not a max contract guy, and was playing amazing in the playoffs. He was putting up great numbers. So, I mean, the funny fact of the matter is, if Rondo had stayed healthy throughout this playoff series, Boston might be going home in five games, and Chicago might be advancing. As is, Boston probably looks in good shape to go forward. But that being said, we're not expecting much from them because they are, as I mentioned, the weakest team in modern NBA history to win their conference. And even the Cavs being weak, Boston's still a worse team. And what we'll just say about the East in general is the East better hope that whatever team out West makes it to the finals, they better hope something happens to them. They get dinged up. They lose 2 star players, because that's the difference to me. The Cavs sweep their first series. The Golden State Warriors sweep their first series. The Cavs sweep their first series with LeBron James playing 44 minutes a game, playing amazing LeBron James level. And he's like, look at how clutch he is. And I'm like, LeBron James shouldn't have to be this clutch in a game against a weak team. As compared to the Golden State Warriors, who their MVP is Kevin Durant. And Kevin Durant played 1 decent game, injured, he riled up his calf injury. They're like, we're not going to play you a lot of minutes. So sits on the bench. I think only played, 10, 15 minutes in the last game. Brian, do you remember how much you played in game 4?
Yeah, about that. Durant, now maybe he's a little higher, maybe 20, but yeah, around 15 is my guess.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is the Warriors are missing their best player. Kevin Durant was easily their best player this season.
Mm-hmm.
They're missing him. They win their series in 4 without needing to rely on Durant, and they're basically nursing him back to health. The Cavaliers win their series in 4, but that's with them having to lean like hell on their star player. So I'm not super optimistic about the East chances, although the one advantage they have is they only have to play one team from the West, so anything can happen, same as last year.
Yeah, that's right. It's funny. When you were saying that, I was thinking about sort of Cleveland versus media narratives and, relative strength and all that. And I think the reason why the media is talking like this is they did have that downward trend, right? They were okay earlier in the year. Their defense kind of got worse and worse. We talked about this a few weeks ago. They ended up, near the bottom of the league and, bottom 10 in defense. And
how bad their defense is, yeah.
Yeah, and so going into the playoffs, and then right before the end, they lost that number 1 seed, right? Boston snuck in and took it. I don't know if maybe people are trolling, but I was seeing people say they're not getting out of the first round. They're finished. Cleveland just sucks. But it's easy to forget everything you're saying about, which is the rest of the East was worse than them, despite that. So yeah, in fact, I think I looked at it that all 5 of the top teams in the West had better SRS than both Boston and Cleveland and anyone else in the East.
Everybody had better. And then the last...
So yeah, Cleveland is flawed, but these other teams are worse. That's all I'm trying to say.
Well, okay, so there are 2 series we can go. I want to wrap up one thing on Boston, too, because there was a little bit of a comment scuffle if you follow the Boxscore Geeks. If you go to boxscoregeeks.com.
Oh, Ainge, yeah.
Andrew Sutton and Robbie have gotten an argument over if Danny Ainge is a good GM or not. What I will say is Danny Ainge is clearly an above average GM. Now, the rough part about that is we have no problem grading GMs on a curve in the NBA because we talk sports being zero sum. So if you're above average, that's actually a good thing, but that doesn't mean we like you. That's the weird thing. A GM can be above average in the NBA and we can still question their moves. And I think one flaw Danny Ainge has had, Arturo has complained about this for years, he is not very good at drafting. We have not been that impressed with how well he drafts. I will say he made some spectacular moves. Trading for Jay Crowder. If he was going to lose Rajon Rondo, getting Jay Crowder back and what they got was amazing. Getting Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce for the draft, for the picks and stuff that he got from the New Jersey Nets, Brooklyn Nets is fantastic. Danny Ainge is clearly an above average GM. But I think he's not great at drafting, and I think he's lucked into some no moves, if that makes sense. We were just talking about how we don't think the Lakers should sign Paul George. We think that would be a mistake, probably. There have been some moves that we have heard rumblings of the Celtics making, essentially trading the entire kitchen sink for the number 9 pick that would have turned into Jim Winslow. Not happening. Not happening at the last second. And that's going, phew, you lucked into that trade not happening. Now, we don't know. That's the problem. So with Danny Ainge, I think, just to answer the comment section, the argument being is Danny Ainge an above average GM, because obviously the rough part if you're a Celtics fan is you have this team that's on the precipice of making the finals for the first time in 4 or 5 years, and we'd argue that the team is the weakest team, and they were very close. And so what I would say about Danny Ainge is I think he's above average, but I think he's got a lot of flaws. And, for instance, signing Al Horford to that big deal was a mistake. Almost giving up the farm for a high draft pick. I'm hardly ever a fan of that, by the way. Even, you'll notice that the Spurs, even when they traded for Kawhi, which we consider the biggest coup of the draft, right? They traded away an above average point guard, which in terms of NBA assets, that's very, very little. So, the Celtics were almost willing to trade away everything just for a high draft pick. And we heard rumblings in this offseason, in this trade deadline, not offseason, that they were close to maybe DeMarcus Cousins or Jimmy Butler and didn't pull the trigger. So I think the reality, if we look at the Celtics, I think Danny Ainge gets a lot of credit, same as Doc Rivers, for that '08 Celtics squad that basically was kind of happenstance and luck. I'm not a fan. I think he's a flawed GM. I think he's above average. That doesn't mean anything because it's going to be rough. Most teams in the NBA suck. This is something I haven't really looked at, Brian. But I mean, obviously, if you look at like a 10-year span of most NBA teams, every team has missed the playoffs at least once, probably more. A lot of teams finish below 500. It's like, what's baffling to me about the NBA is when someone says, well, they're a top 10 GM, it's like, so, I mean, basically it's kind of the Spurs. I don't want to inflate your ego, Brian, but I will. Right now, at least, a little bit, the Warriors. Right now, it's the Spurs, the Warriors, and everybody else, in my opinion.
Light years ahead is what you're saying.
With how they've been in the last 3 seasons, I would say post passing on Kevin Love for Klay Thompson, which I still argue is a mistake. But, I mean, all the credit in the world, it worked out for him because Klay Thompson at $16 million a year as opposed to Kevin Love on a max deal meant that they could afford Durant. It meant that they played Draymond Green more at the 4. Is what it is. They got Andre Iguodala. So, I guess I'll say since that move, everything they've done since has basically looked positive. So,
well, to go against Arturo, in Danny Ainge's defense, he did draft Tony Allen, the great, great Tony Allen. So I will give him credit for that draft pick.
That's like 3 billion years ago, man.
Well, I can't even count that high. You're right.
Okay, so the other team I wanted to talk about out east, I guess, just trying to make sure we get at least give a little attention to every series. Toronto, I guess the Lowry-less first round of the playoffs continues. This has been kind of a running theme. Kyle Lowry is always kind of cold in the playoffs, and he was, but it's 2-2. They did the opposite of holding home court, as you mentioned. They basically split 1-1, but Toronto's tied 2-2. Milwaukee has the superior player in Giannis, and I think I've been liking how Chris Middleton's been playing. Toronto is the far superior squad, so we'll have to see what happens.
NBA.com is saying that it's Toronto's up 3-2 now. So was that game yesterday, Game 5?
Oh, did I miss? Oh, apologies. Yeah, I guess they were. So yeah, they're up 3-2.
I was 100% sure, but
I would trust ESPN over my memory. So
no, sorry, this is NBA.com.
Or NBA.com, ESPN.com, any sports site that keeps track of statistics. Okay, so so the Raptors are up 3-2. I think something that happens a lot in the playoffs is people overreact quickly, and actually I will use that as an excuse to jump to the next series I want to talk, which is LA versus Utah.
I'll just say Giannis is great. The rest of the Bucks suck, so they probably aren't going to go anywhere.
Good job.
Go ahead, Trey.
So I'm stalling while I turn off autoplay. But what's surprising to me in the NBA is you look at a player's regular season numbers, you look at like Kyle Lowry, you go, wow, he's a great player. And then they have a couple bad playoff games and people are like calling for their heads. And you just got to remember, one team's better than the other and you'd expect them to win. And, anything can happen in the playoffs. We stress that a lot. But you shouldn't overreact to a small sample size, even if they lose, right? Even if Toronto had lost to Milwaukee, you could just say Milwaukee went on a hot stretch. I've said that before in past where we've seen players like LeBron James, Pau Gasol, even the great Kobe Bryant being mocking there, go on cold stretches for 4 or 5 games. And we wouldn't ask to trade that player after a 4 or 5 game stretch. So in the playoffs, why do you get shocked? So, I think you always have a chance when you have the best player in the series. The Bulls have Butler, the Bucks have Giannis. The other thing I'll note about him that's interesting is the two players we like looking at the Bucks are Greg Monroe and Giannis, and people have apparently just the Bucks included decided to hate Greg Monroe, so he doesn't get major minutes. So it's kind of like if of their two great players, they really have to rely heavily on Giannis, and they're not going to play Greg Monroe lots of minutes. They're kind of at a disadvantage. I'm not a huge Bucks fan. As I mentioned, I'm pissed that they're taking a quarter. I looked this up. It's $250 million for their stadium. I don't like their head of analytics because he said something mean about me on Twitter. Basically, I like Giannis. Giannis is the only part of the Bucks I like, even living in the same state. And I'm not going to feel bad if Toronto takes him out. That's where I stand there.
Yeah, so I think the reason why the Raptors fans are down on them and Lowry specifically is similar to what you're saying about the Spurs, is that they've kind of underperformed in the playoffs the last few seasons relative to their regular seasons.
And a lot of it's Kyle Lowry. Kyle Lowry disappeared from the playoffs. I don't get it.
But I'll agree with you and Billy being there. I don't know. Let's see a few more games. Kyle Lowry's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually in an unofficial playoff pool, and what I will say is I bet on Toronto to win the East.
There we go. I want to see him do it. I want Canada to get some, and
it was it's a very boring metric. They have the highest SRS in the East. That was basically it. And I think Cleveland, let's be honest, Cleveland is 2 games of LeBron James having back spasms away from not winning the finals. It's not making the finals. It's that simple. Even Kevin Love, I love Kevin Love. I mean, he's not shooting great. I like Kyrie Irving, but all he really does is shoot. The rest of that team is a steaming pile of garbage. I'm sorry, outside of Tristan Thompson is good, but then we've also noted Tristan Thompson and Kevin Love are kind of redundant. So the rough part about that team is it is not a well-constructed team, and its bench has gotten significantly weaker. I mean, how am I dropping his name? Help me out. Used to play for the Hawks. 3-point shooter, really old, billion years old.
Oh, yeah. I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
You were on the ball, Brian.
I can picture, he looks like Ashton Kutcher, but I don't remember his name.
Apologies. If you're listening to this instead of watching the playoffs.
Everyone knows who this guy is. We just don't know his name right now.
Korver. You should be watching.
Kyle Korver. Yeah, there we go. Kyle Korver.
Let's see.
You knew it was a Kyle.
Okay, LA versus Utah. Only thing I got to say about this was the most bizarre thing to me and most playoffy point ever. Last game came down to Joe Johnson versus Jamal Crawford. What the hell? Gordon Hayward left early with food illness. I mean, I was feeling so bad for Utah this series because this seemed like Utah's year for me. Let's just be clear. If Utah keeps Gordon Hayward and Rudy Gobert, and just gets average players.
Favors gets healthy too. Favors being hurt this year has been bad for them.
But I'm saying this is a Stockton-Malonis situation. Gordon Hayward plus Rudy Gobert, in my opinion, is like the modern day kind of variant of Stockton and Malone, meaning you have a perimeter shooter that's great. You have an inside defensive-minded center that's great. Anytime you're a team that has those two combinations, you are set. And by the way, let's point out the Clippers have the same scenario with Chris Paul and DeAndre Jordan. We've just noted that the Clippers, and this is why we're kind of saying Utah just get average players, because that's our complaint with the Clippers. They have players like Jamal Crawford and Austin Rivers and Mo Spates. Like, for F's sakes, they've surrounded the modern day Stockton Malone with horrible players. And what we're saying to Utah is please don't do that. We'd love to see Gobert and Hayward have some level of success. We would love it. And it's this playoff series has felt rough because Gobert gets injured, we're like, come on. And then Gobert is back, and then Hayward gets injured, like, come on. But I will say that is the most playoffy thing. And this is, people overreact to the playoffs, and this series is perfect because I hate Jamal Crawford. He's gotten the 6th Man of the Year award 3 times. He's just a chucker. He's a below average scorer. But what you have to note about any high volume score is they're going to have variance. They're going to have some games where they can't miss and they score 30 points on 70% true shooting. And they're going to have games where they can't hit the broadside of the barn and they go 2 for 11. Jamal Crawford had an amazing scoring game. People were like, Jamal Crawford's clutch. Aren't you happy we have Jamal Crawford? And I'm like, and my response is, well, guess what? If Jamal Crawford, if you had an average player instead of Jamal Crawford, you could be the number 3 seed instead of the number 4 seed. So probably not. And then Joe Johnson, who is a billion years old, came back and played well. Now, what I'll note is, if you look at Joe Johnson's career, I think he's been overrated. I think a lot of people consider him a star player. I don't think. I think he's very similar to Paul George in that regard. And in fact, this should make Suns fans really irked because if you recall, there was a year where the Suns were really, really close to the finals, and Joe Johnson's face got like he had a broken nose. He broke his face and missed like
Oh, I remember that. He had to wear a mask for a long time.
he
He might
missed like
still, yeah.
he missed like 3 games in the conference finals. So the point being, they got to be really mad that they missed out on Joe Johnson in the playoffs because that would have made, like I said, overrated. I don't think he was a star, but he's Paul George, was an above average player, and he went off. So this was a very playoff game where I'm like, the star players that are supposed to dictate who wins this game did not. It came down to Joe Johnson versus Jamal Crawford. I will also say that, holy cow, Chris Paul is really good at basketball. He deserves better than this team.
Yeah, Joe Johnson is interesting. Well, let's see. I've got his numbers up right now, so I might as well put him on screener. He's had a very long career. It's been a very average career. He hasn't been terrible. He'd just be like guy you'd want as your sixth man maybe, and that's fine. The problem is he's gotten big contracts, right? He's gotten paid a lot of money. So
he's worth minutes, and for what it's worth, when the Suns traded him, they were right. I forget the exact deals of the contract. When I looked over it, I was like, you traded a slightly above average scorer on a team that doesn't need it, right? That team had Steve Nash, Amari Stoudemire.
So you're saying the first time back in 0405.
When the Suns decided not to match his contract and get rid of him, some people said, man, what were they thinking? And the reality is they were right, and they actually won that trade. And the actual sad reality is when they first signed Joe Johnson to his first contract with the Suns, they had drafted Luol Deng, and they traded away Luol Deng's rights. So the Suns actually kept Luol Deng and let Joe Johnson walk. Oh man, that team wins a title. That team wins a title.
Interesting.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get off on history, but that was all. I mean, like I said, very playoffy. I'm excited to see this series. I hope it goes 7 with Utah taking it. That would be great.
Yeah, with Gobert being out and with again Hayward having the food poisoning, I would like to have seen the Clippers to have done a lot more work and not be tied right now. They're the home team in the series. With Gobert, the MVP level player being out, they should be up 3-1 or so up the series now. So now it's a little more even. So one thing is Blake Griffin is out. That hurts their depth a lot. That means they're going to have to play, if they play Mbah Moute more minutes, maybe that's okay. But if they have to go smaller and play Jamal Crawford more, that's not going to be good. So Blake Griffin is kind of overrated. So this isn't as bad as it seems.
Well, again, let's just.
But it hurts it depth wise.
I think Blake Griffin. I don't think Blake Griffin's overrated. I think everything. I'm going to sound like the DeMarcus Cousins homers. Everything I've seen out of Blake Griffin indicates that he could have been a Larry Birdish player had he stayed healthy. But that's the important thing to remember is health is not a guarantee in sports. Blake Griffin has been banged up his entire career, and people vastly underestimate what that means.
Whatever the reason, I'm not blaming him, but I'm just saying the effect of him being out isn't as great as the media might see.
When you say so, what all I want to stress is when Blake Griffin got drafted, and then when Blake Griffin got his first extension, I didn't think either of those were bad moves. I just think he's been injured, and so you can't, that's one of those players where, I've graded moves in the past, like Luol Deng to the Lakers was a horrible move. I can't be mad at Blake Griffin's contracts or minutes based on how he's played. All I can say is he is a cautionary tale to remember. Even the best potential players that look like the next whatever can get injured.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's finish. Let's do I have nothing to say. I have not watched Washington Atlanta at all, man. Obviously, Washington was up 2-0. It's the classic story. They looked on pace to do whatever. They're tied 2-2. I think when I checked last, like Paul Millsap was the deciding factor in the last game.
He had a great game. Yeah, I watched that game yesterday. I just got to say, like, Atlanta's guards are just suck. Like, okay, Schroeder's been okay, but he's not a good player overall. Bazemore's not great either. Like, that's just going to be a problem for them. Like, Howard's been so good. That's been such a great signing for them. But, boy, they're missing Korver now. They're missing any semblance of guard play for them. And Washington is funny. You look at 4 of their starters, and you're like, man, these 4 guys are really good. But then there's Markieff Morris in there as their power forward, and he's just like Paul George, but way, way worse as a power forward. So, yeah, I mean, and again, I hate to call these players bad because let's just make this clear. Like, Markieff Morris and everyone else I'm saying bad are really, really good basketball players. They're just not as good as the guys they're playing against the NBA, but they are the best players in the world. Still, I look at that lineup and I say, Markieff Morris, that's going to be rough for the Hawks. So this 4-5 matchup, seems like they're not going to do that well going forward, whoever wins.
All right, so let's go. The last series, I was stalling a little bit on this, Houston to see up OKC, but of course they kept it close.
Oh, did you just look at the score? How's that going?
They're up by three in the fourth. 5 minutes to go, so they're keeping it close. But Houston OKC, again, just a weird thing. The player of the game last game was Nene. Uh, I've seen a lot of hate towards Westbrook, just because high usage, which I find just fascinating at this point. I am fascinated to see the railings against Westbrook and hero ball and all that. And all I can say, two things. I mentioned there's a Dean Oliver post that I may write a follow-up post to where he says Westbrook doesn't deserve MVP, which I'll just point out is completely against the mentality he had when he wrote Basketball on Paper. Of course, that was over a decade ago. Maybe he's grown and matured as a person. Um, but the idea that Westbrook just is not performing at MVP level for this team, and we say the opposite. What we say is, so this is clear, Westbrook's win contribution this season is essentially identical to last season. What we'll note is last season he ranked fourth in MVP voting, is what it is. The Thunder have a worse offense than last season, are 8 games worse than they were last season, and it's not really hard to explain that. They lost Kevin Durant, and they are currently playing a better team that has home court advantage. So it's really shocking to me for people to basically be mad at the Thunder and Westbrook basically for not winning games like these when they're not supposed to win. The Rockets have a stronger team than the Thunder. So all I can say about this series is, I do think Westbrook's forcing it. Something Arturo's gotten very angry about, though, is that Westbrook isn't getting major minutes. We noticed that Cleveland played the wheels off of LeBron James to win that series, and the Thunder have not cracked 40 minutes a game for Westbrook, and I think he might do that this game. So for all that's worth, I thought this would be a closer series. It might be, they might pull this one out here, and then it'll be 2-2 or 3-2. Sorry, obviously not paying enough attention, Brian. I don't have much more else to say beyond that, other than Houston's a better team. They have had some. I mean, let's look at this. The cool thing is Houston versus OKC. They've had some very very. They had a close game the other game, so that's all I got.
Yeah, and I don't know if we want to skip this thing about the Pat Beverly incident or not with the Oklahoma City minority owner. I could skip it, but we're
fill me in and we'll talk it, and then
we'll run through this real fast and then try to get out of here because it's kind of a long show. But so I'll just kind of run through this and ask you for your initial thoughts, and then we can move on. So basically, what happened was it was kind of caught on cell phone video, and it's not really clear what happened. But what people have pieced together is that one of the minority owners, or I guess the son of the minority owner, I don't know if the son is actually technically part of the ownership group or not, of Oklahoma City, came over and got in Beverly's face, talked trash to him, and then Beverly went and found him after the game, and they talked even further, and it wasn't physical or anything, but Beverly ends up getting fined $25,000 for this. And I had a lot of mixed feelings about this because so first of all, Beverly's main point is the NBA needs to protect their players better, and I don't have any regrets with the way I acted because the NBA doesn't protect me and it lets these guys come down on top of me and get in my face. So, and I have kids, and I think what he was getting at is saying basically, I'm going to set the tone for my kids that you can't back down to somebody that's a bully. I think is where he was going with I have kids when he was saying that. So, I got a lot of different thoughts about this. First, like the side conversation is, are we really surprised that Kevin Durant left Oklahoma City with this ownership group? And, the city might be kind of racist. Sorry, yeah, Oklahoma City. I love Tulsa. My family's from there. But are we that surprised, to see this happen? Secondly, I have mixed feelings about Beverly. So so first of all, the tone of his interview and everything, just very intelligent, very thoughtful. You can tell that he put a lot into thinking about his answer, and that made me kind of where he was coming from with it, and his tone made me accept it a lot more than someone like, say, DeMarcus Cousins, who is just kind of being immature and saying he's getting picked on, right? So Beverly had the opposite tone of that. So that
want to
was
hear on
endearing.
that, because what I'll say is fascinating about sports to me is sports is a high adrenaline scenario, and we've kind of talked the weird implicit rules about what you're not supposed to do, right? Like in baseball, if you don't jog out a routine ground out, you get yelled at by the dugout, whatever. So it's really weird to want the players to be high adrenaline, high energy, and then expect them to be entirely rational in the event of something happening, right? Someone stepping on the court. And by the way, a random weird note, I guess the Houston Rockets owner stepped on the court to yell at the refs
Oh,
this game.
that's funny,
So
but no, just to tie in with what you're saying, that's the economic tension here, right? The league wants to sell these seats where the fans are right next to the players, like sitting one seat away in some cases, and they can have this access. But then there's this protection problem, right? If you're selling this access to the fans, then it encroaches on the players who are your employees and you want to take care of them, but they need to toe the company line. So
but
this
then
is
also,
a tough question.
and then it's super rough because it's like it's always annoying to me that people the rationality standpoint thoughts. All right, this is a weird tangent, Brian, but let's do that and wrap up. But the rationality standpoint, the idea of like the uber logical thinker, the stupid trope, like Sheldon on Big Bang Theory, Sherlock on Sherlock, is bullshit because obviously the context, your attitude, your inebriation level, all of these other factors, your sleep level, impact your ability to cognitively function. And we're also, as humans, we're not really good enough to access all of the information and make as fast of a decision you want, right? Like if you and this is what makes athletes amazing, right? Steve Nash or Chris Paul, let's go Chris Paul because he's active, or Russell Westbrook. These players, we watch them make these amazing passes and you go, there are 10 players on the court, including yourself. There are refs, there are all these other moving pieces, and you had to make a decision in half a second and derive as much information as quickly as possible. And that's amazing. And what always bugs me when we get mad at athletes for kind of going off in these situations is we want you to pull in all of the information at once, also make a rational thinking decision about it while you're amped up on adrenaline. And if you don't, we're going to say you failed. And I'm not necessarily saying that's wrong. I'm not necessarily even saying the fine is wrong. I haven't looked into it enough in depth. But I'm saying it is a ridiculous assumption. And I find that sports fans are very two-faced about this, where on the one hand, if we notice a player being lackadaisical, right, that's a common argument about James Harden's defense, right? He's lackadaisical on some defense. I know a great coach, Nick Point, was if you take any player in the NBA, any player, and you have a video editor go over their last 10 games, you can come up with a video compilation that makes them look like a horrible defender. There are going to be some players that they know they're beat on defense. They're not even going to try. They just stop. They don't want to get posterized. Any player is going to end up in that enough times to make a Sports Center top 10 if you go back far enough. And, fans get very angry at that. And then at the same time go with when players like DeMarcus Cousins spout off, they go, why is he running his mouth? And we've kind of defended DeMarcus Cousins going, if you had to deal with this crap day after day after day, eventually it would wear on you. And it wouldn't just be like wears on you and you outburst once and reset. It would be like you would start outbursting multiple times.
Yeah, and so think about, what Beverly's mindset is. So when he's playing, he's known as a defensive player, right? And one of the ways we rate coaches is just how hard can you get your team to play. And if you're a great team like Houston is, maybe they're not known as a defensive team, but they're in the playoffs. They're playing really hard on defense every play. They're putting everything they have in it. They're literally wrecking their bodies for their profession here. And they've got to put up with these jokers that are just sitting inches away from them, like affecting their ability to make a living. Yeah, I agree with you. It's, boy.
Then pointed out the annoying part is those seats are the premium, right? Those seats you can sell for the highest cost or charge the team. So from that perspective, what gets super obnoxious, we've always talked that sports is always a mix of commerce and, which team is the best. And, there are times where the NBA very clearly says commerce trumps the other, right? When you have a team play a back-to-back, but put it as a nationally televised game, you're making a very clear symbol that you don't care about the highest level of competition.
Isn't this exactly like the resting players situation? It's very similar to me.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the right maneuver for the NBA would be to have there be more space between the floor and the players. And in fact, I believe a book, Scorecasting, noted that referees, umpires get influenced by home crowds, and part of it is proximity to the crowd. So, for instance, they have soccer fields, and some soccer fields have horse tracks around them. And so what happens is they notice that the bias of refs goes down in those fields as compared to those without because the crowd is further back from yelling. So obviously having fans floor seat, and I've sat really close to floor seat. It's so amazing when you get first, second row. It's so cool, Brian. There was a Heat game where the Heat played the Nuggets when I was living in Denver, and I got to sit basically second row right behind the basket, and I got to see LeBron James dunk, and that's like watching Godzilla destroy a city. I mean, he is giant. He's amazing. That's a great experience, and I love it, right? And I was willing to pay the money for it. Nice being in Denver because it was cheaper. Like if I lived in LA, that would have been like a mortgage payment, but it was very affordable in Denver. So that's awesome, and I totally understand that. But then at the same time, like you're saying, that makes the refs more biased. That ups the chance of things like the Malice in the Palace, where the Indiana Pacers basically got destroyed because half their team got suspended because they got in a fight with an unruly fan.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
It's a trade-off, and we don't have an easy answer. So, but
No.
I will. Good job. I thought that was going to be a quick topic, and it was like a 10-minute
Well,
discussion.
let's do this craft thing as a shout out then, not a real topic.
Okay, I'll let you do that as a shout out, and that'll be our show. I think we hit them all. And by the way, just as a follow up, it's looking like there could be late game heroics. We've seen it before. The Houston Rockets are up by 6 with 30 seconds to go. Never say never. I mean, one of those games where it's only 4 now with 12 seconds to go. So there may be some late game heroics, but it's looking like Houston is going to take the series.
Is Russell Westbrook going to be gone fishing tonight? We'll see.
So we'll see. So why don't you do your shout out? By the time you do that, the game might be over.
Okay, sure. So yeah, this is an article on Deadspin by Bart Hubbock, and it's titled, "This is the story about Robert Kraft's casino holdings that Rupert Murdoch's paper never ran." So he used to be a writer for the New York Post. He got fired for them for trying to write an article about Robert Kraft's casino holdings, which are apparently against the laws of the NFL because the NFL is so anti-gambling, even though they're really not. So this just more kind of hypocrisy from the NFL. They come out against gambling, but unless it's one of our most powerful owners, then we'll just kind of let him do it. And we'll conspire with Rupert Murdoch to fire New York Post writers if they try to write stories about it. So really interesting story about media and pro sports. So check that out. And one more shout out about the Houston Rockets, actually. We talked about them a lot this game. It was an article written by Trevor Ariza, a player we really like, in the Players Tribune. And the title is Bearded Picasso is the MVP. I love the nickname Bearded Picasso. I don't know if Trevor Ariza made that up or not, or if he got it from somewhere. Maybe that's been in Houston for a long time, but I like that nickname. So good job, Trevor Ariza, on this article.
I might throw my wife under the bus a little here, but this was funny. We had a date night recently. My parents were in town and babysat, which was awesome. So we actually got to go out. We went to a pub, tons of them in Wisconsin, and the playoffs were on, which was really cool too. And so the TV's on, and my wife looks up and she goes, that guy has quite the beard. And I said, "You're talking about James Harden." And she goes, "How do you know?" And I said, "Because his nickname is the Beard." So she didn't know who James Harden was. She does actually recognize Russell Westbrook, which is funny. But yeah, Bearded Picasso is oh my God, it's making that title makes me love Trevor Ariza more. Of course, I agree with. I think James Harden is our mainstream MVP. We say Rudy Gobert, but accept that if this is kind of like a Game of Thrones thing, we understand that Rudy Gobert will never get the votes. So if I had a vote in the NBA,
right.
I would give my number 1 to James Harden to prevent a split.
So if you're Littlefinger, you're just going to backstab Robert Baratheon and put the Lannisters in charge. I respect that. That's very pragmatic.
Absolutely. It occurs to me I have no shout-outs, Brian. I did not think of anything this week. But your 2 shout-outs were amazing.
Shout out to your parents for babysitting.
Oh, my God. Well, actually, you'll notice the funny thing about the article content is, I think I've gotten some props from Patrick where he said, "Wow, how's Dre managing to do articles with a kid?" And what I'll say is when Daniel wakes me up early in the morning for a feeding and I'm up and I can't go back to sleep or, whatever, or I just need to help out, I'll be up and awake and alert and I'm just there and I'll write. And when my content goes down, it's actually because he's being a good boy and sleeping through the night. And then this weekend, same thing. My parents were in town and watched him. And I had 3 article ideas that I was hoping to put up my top 10 thoughts about the playoffs. Like I mentioned, I have a post about Russell Westbrook's MVP bids, all this stuff. Nothing happened. So the funny note about having a kid is it can help your productivity when you're getting deprived of sleep, but when they actually start letting you sleep, it drops your productivity because being a new parent, sleep is just such a luxury. You will take it over anything. So, and by the way, yeah, it happens. There's a virus that comes with being a new parent, which is you talk about being a new parent all the time. And so I'm sorry. Definitely.
Let's see. Have you changed your Facebook or Twitter picture yet to being your kid instead of yourself? That's the real indication.
Facebook, yes, but I keep that more private. Oh, friends.
There we go.
Twitter, yeah, I haven't changed it forever. It's still the Boxscore Geeks avatar. Well, anyway, that has been our show. Come on, the stupid game didn't finish up. So if there were some late games heroics and Houston didn't hold on, let us know in the comments. But regardless of that, we've been the Boxscore Geeks Show. You can find us on iTunes and Stitcher, the Boxscore Geeks Show. Find us not through the site. You can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. We go live every week. I think we're just going to aim for 9:30 p.m. On Tuesdays, Brian. 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, twitch.tv/nerd numbers. If you missed the live show, you can catch the recaps. YouTube. I almost said Utah. I was reading Utah off the script, Brian. YouTube channel Nerd Numbers. I've been your host, Ray Alvarez. You can find me on Twitter as Nerd Numbers. Co-host Brian Foster on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Just a shout out for our normal co-host who couldn't be here this week, Patrick Minton. You can find on Twitter as NBA Geek. Thanks so much, and we will see you next time.